Well, the AFL draft and the rookie draft run and done. It's been a week or so just waiting for the dust to settle, and players have arrived at the club and gone through the first few sessions. We also take this time to obviously look at the list as a whole. But as we did 12 months ago, Kevin Shifter Sheehan, AFL talent manager, no one knows as much about this talent as he does. And Shifter, nice to have you on with us once again.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. I suppose it is great to reflect a week or so later and get an independent view of how you've gone. But off the top, I'd say you've done pretty well. Geez, when you look at the CVs of the boys you selected, and we'll go through them, but yeah, they read pretty well.
Yeah, I was going to say, we'll dig a little bit deeper in a moment. We were talking a bit about it off air, but the draft did start with a couple of tributes, and both of them of relevance to the Saints. Only Beveridge in particular. We've spoken to a lot of players from the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s on this podcast, and he would have had his name all over those recruits. But can you chat to us a little bit about Bevo's legacy and obviously a sad loss for the game?
Yeah, it was a sad loss. He'd been wonderful for the game, very popular figure in recruiting ranks, and to think that way back there at the start of drafting, he was about, we're talking 1986, he was there. I remember him saying to me once that, I don't know how we're going to go getting guys from WA. We can't afford the flight to get over there. So I just ring up a couple of past players. That were the early days when things were pretty tough. But he lived through all of that to a point where you look at some of the great choices he made, both early. Yeah, you'd be happy with when you get the number one and the number two, and you pick Cozzy and the Roo, and they play 600 games between them. You couldn't have expected much more from two great players, and arguably Nick Riefhold and Luke Hodge are the two best ever number ones over the history with 38 years into drafting, and John was part of that. But some of the later Lenny Hayes at 11, Nick Del Santo at 13, champions of the club, champions of the game. Super Lee Montagna at 37, I think it was, nearly 300 games. That's a great choice. He's a lightly built wingman from Vic Metro and the Northern Knights had become a star of the game, a dual All-Australian as well. And that's in the, the late fees, picking up guys like that. Stevie Baker, gee, what a player he was, 200 games. I think that's the benchmark. If you get these days, you mark it as a big tick if you get a guy that can play a couple hundred games for you. And most years, 18 or 20 out of the 100 taken might get to about that mark. So you're hoping you've got 6 players this time. You're probably hoping you might get 4 out of the 6 that get through to something like that, have a real strong contribution to your footy club. You keep them for most of your careers, as most of these boys stayed there. Lenny Hayes and these sorts of boys and Lee played out their careers at the club. You hope that they don't dart off somewhere else at some point. But, John, fantastic. He'd go to a game and you'd look for John. He'd have his own chair. He'd be on the far wing. When the siren blows, he'd have the binoculars up right from the start and never miss a trick as to what was occurring. I'd often do a lap, go for a walk at halftime and have a chat to him, see what he thought, what he'd observed. He had a great eye for talent, no doubt about that, and a wonderful passion for the game, a love of his footy club, and just that memorial service street was wonderful when Ross Smith got up and announced that the best first-year player at St Kilda will be named after John Beveridge, in recognition of his contribution to the Saints over that period of time. So, yeah, we miss him. We missed him in recent years as he found it pretty tough at the finish, but what a contribution, a true saint from our point of view.
Shifter, I was going to ask you, you talked about looking for him at games, but what was he like, I guess, at games? Did you have a favourite memory or a favourite experience kind of with JB? Because I imagine the recruiting fraternity's not enormous, right? Like, you guys talk to each other, different clubs talk to each other, recruiters switch teams and all that sort of stuff. I mean, what was he like in person at games? And, yeah, did you have a kind of a favourite memory or an experience with him?
Well, it was nearly always the same, that we'd have a quick chat. Like, you're on the way, you walk on a lap of the ground, as I would be, so I'd stop for a couple of minutes. What have you seen would be the first question. And he wouldn't hold back. He'd tell you, gee, I like that young, let's call it Del Santo, the kid from Bendigo on the wing. I love the way, what do you think? So we'd have a back and forth about what we'd observed in the game, basically. And he was forthright and given his opinion of who caught the eye for him. That would give you a say as well. And that's all it was, a couple of minutes like that. He contributed very strongly. We used recruiters also in all our All-Australian selection groups, whether it be 16s and 18s, and he'd be very forthright with his views there. Forthright in that believed in what he knew about the player, what he could see. It wasn't overbearing in any way at all, just in a very modest way would give a very straight and honest opinion on what he thought of that player and his worthiness to be picked, say, All-Australian. Yeah, so wonderful man to... Yeah, and that's why you respected him so much. He'd always give a little bit. He'd talk to everyone, very popular, right across all of the clubs, and had the respect of everyone.
Do you remember any particular player?
Well, it was Nick Del Santo that I can clearly remember him saying that I really do fancy the way he goes about. He's just such a smooth mover. His left foot's pinpoint. He covers the ground. I just hope he's there, when we're choosing. It was one of those sorts of things because it was really, that was back in the days of the Super Draft. It was a great group. He's picking at 13. You don't know whether the guy's going to go at 7 or 8 or 9 or 10, and you won't get the one you want. But I knew that's the player he wanted. He at least confided in me that, and then he got to get that player. And wow, 300 and something games later, he had a few at North, but mostly with the Saints. He's just such a wonderful player. And not far off a couple of Brownlow medals. He might have run second a couple of times or third. He's right up around the mark, and an All-Australian on multiple occasions as well. But, yeah, John was really, really keen on getting him in that particular draft and was lucky enough to still have him on the board when it was St Kilda's call.
Shifter, tell us a little bit about Chris Toce. Chris was on Unpluggered a couple of times a few years ago, back when he was at the footy club. Obviously, he had a massive impact on the state of the current St Kilda list. What are some of your memories of Chris?
Yeah, Chris, what a tragic turn of events. It was unbelievable, really. 4 months. It was just a couple of months into his reign there at Richmond, and he was in charge of the recruiting, that he was diagnosed with cancer. I think most people know the story, but I remember corresponding, texting him when I found out, and he come back to me very positive about how it was going at that particular time. I sent him back the example of Mick Turner, a mate of mine from Geelong that had suffered cancer and really was able to fight it off, and he had some discipline routine in which he was going through. I shared that with Chris, and he liked that example I'd given, and he had such a positive mindset. I remember seeing him then in the September finals of the Coates Talent League. All the scouts are there, and there he is, and looked to be right back on deck then, and it just tragically just went downhill from there in a couple of weeks. Just so sad to see that a young man that was fulfilling his dream. He called himself a bit of a Hawthorn nuffy that loved the Hawks as a young fella, followed them religiously, and to get his dream job working firstly at Collingwood, then at St Kilda, then finally there at Richmond in recruiting, was just an unbelievable reward for the great work he'd put in over a long period of time to finally get that job. And then the day he passed was the day that they end up with the 8 choices in 24. You wouldn't believe it. Probably would have been the best day of his life. It could have been. And that's how cruel life can be, unfortunately or tragically. Much respected. Again, dealing with him this year is a part of our Allies selection group. So we had many a chat about the prospects of the Allies this year. We get clubs who are independent of the 4 clubs up north to help us pick the best kids to play for the Allies, and Richmond have always been willing to participate in that, and that's the way Chris was as well. Very giving and had some very well thought through views on players, and pretty accurate ones too.
Yeah, and very giving with us too, given the importance of his role. He would step up and chat to us all the time. And, you look at the guys running around now, Owens, Windhager, Wanganeen Miller, Filippo, Max King, the list goes on, that he's had a major hand in. This year's crop.
Cal Wilkie is one of those.
Cal Wilkie,
straight out of the state league.
Best and fairest winner at the club in this season just gone. But looking for some of those selections this year, obviously, the back-to-back picks, there was some debate about whether they'd split them or whether they'd trade one and go back and get a couple more, but they'd use them both first up. Toby Travaglia, your summary of him, St Kilda's first pick, obviously they didn't get one of the perceived elite mids that were in that bracket of the top 6 or 7. They've landed on Toby Travaglia. Comparisons with Will Day, obviously can play as a running half-back, but what do you make of him?
Well, I'll tell you one comparison with the chance to reflect a little bit and knowing where he's now gone. Jaron Geary for mine. Geez, like him. Geez, like him. They're both from Bendigo too, of course. Different clubs up that way. Travaglia's from Sandhurst and Jaron was from Eagle Hawk. Taking at different ends of the draft too. You talk about Johnny Beveridge and plucking one. Well, I think Jaron was 58 in the rookie draft. I reckon there was about 5 taken after him. He was at the back of the barrel. He'd won the best and fairest for the Pioneers. So he shares that with Travaglia. He won it as a 17-year-old last year. He beat Harley Reid. He was second. So that's not a bad one to have up your sleeve to have beaten Harley Reid in the best and fairest when you're a bottom major. And then he's bobbed up this year, had another great year. The best and fairest winner was, you've grabbed him as well, and that's Barrett of the Pioneers. So you've got 2 very well-performed boys out of Bendigo. And if they end up as good or half as good as Jaron Geary, who end up one of the most courageous players in the game, getting everything out of himself, captained your football club, of course, and still working in the industry. So he plays like him with his desperate attack on the ball. He reads it very, very well, intercepts well, and then takes off with it. His form early this year was fantastic, and we added him to the Australian under-18 team after about a month of footy, and he dominated in that game against Coburg, just right from the start. He was running people down. You know, he'd be maybe 2 or 3 metres out of the contest, but his acceleration to get there with desperation and skill to spoil was stood out. Then the intercept marks and then the dash with the ball and his use of it was all super. And then there's another memory from our combine. You know, he tested really well, but the 2K up, all the kids are lined up. They're all pretty nervous and dying to get into it. And we want to see not just how they run, are they going to run all day, but how they'll compete. You know, that's part of it all. How do they cope with that? And there's 18 clubs watching. Well, he took off like, I used to say Vo Rogue, I'll have to say Pride of Jenny, is the way he took off. He was 20 metres in front. They've gone 200 metres from the pack. He bolted away. And we're making silly comments to ourselves that maybe the jockey's forgotten how many laps it is. You know, he thinks it's a one lapper, and away he went. But he ended up being the second overall in that time trial of all of the best. There was 50 of the 67 tested. There's always a few injuries and niggles and things, but he's out there, so he's second of the 50. So that's what his endurance and competitiveness is like. So he'll leave it all out there. Don't worry about that. He'll give every bit. He'll be a heart and soul type player for you, and has had 2 brilliant years in a row. But I haven't seen him play a poor game. So we look forward to watching him play. He's very, very exciting. He needs a bit more body, as most of the kids do when they come in. You put on 4 or 5, maybe 8 kilos over 2 or 3 years to be towards his best. But he's got some real talent, that boy.
Do you see him moving into the midfield with his kind of footy IQ and his makeup, or do you see kind of the club probably happy to have him as an elite halfback, kind of intercept guy?
Yeah, I've seen him play a little bit wing and a little bit up in the midfield, but I see him as intercepting brilliantly and setting the whole play up with rebound from there. I reckon he's special back there. We've talked about a few examples. You know, see, Tom Stewart goes in there a bit for the Geelong and he's useful in there, but gee, he's a brilliant halfback when he intercepts and sets it up from down there. So maybe at times, we'll see what Ross wants to do with him over time. I think he'll start as a defender, and let's see what comes from that in the early days. But, very exciting player.
And so our second pick 10, ended up being in the end after we went for one of the Gold Coast's young kids, but they decided to follow him. From my hometown, actually, Alix Tauru, the Viking, as it sounds like we've really got told we're going to be calling him. So he's another defender, listed as a defender, and from the highlights we've seen, he's a run back with a pack and mark, a run off with the ball again. Looks like I even looked at a few bits and pieces and thought it's a little bit of, say, Kalwuki about him. Then I looked at other bits and pieces and looked like there was a bit of, say, Dougal Howard about him. He was just throwing himself at it. And it seems like he's got quite a bit that he's going to be able to add back there, but also move up the field a little bit at times as well.
Yeah.
How did you see him before we landed him?
Well, I think if we go back to maybe March, we might have even heard of him at that point, March at the start of this year. He'd only played 2 or 3 games last year, had injuries and things, so he wasn't on the radar, wasn't in the Vic Country squad. So then he's emerged. I remember seeing a game at Dandenong down at Shipley Oval there, and I go, wow, this kid can mark it. It's across half back. He might have taken 7 or 8 marks in the game. And my head's going down just checking his name all the time because I had and then asked the Gippsland people about him, and they explained he'd been injured even early in the year. And so, you make note that he looks to have some real AFL potential. And again, wasn't in the Vic Country squad at that point. He didn't play the first game of that, but then stepped right up and played the next three and played, as you described, some really exciting games. He's a graceful mover over the ground that end up playing not just back, but in the midfield and in forward. There was a game at Latrobe late in the year where Gippsland played, and it was a windy day. The wind was blowing one end. Well, he stayed at the one end all day. Why not? Because he was marking it. He was judging it in the wind like no other player, and he was a standout. You're saying if there's one AFL player out there, that's the one. It was a big move day for this kid that maybe took 10 marks that day. And again, thinking about it, I tell you who reminds me of the Saints fans. I hope he ends up half as good. Trevor Barker. Just the marking, the blonde hair, just the suntan skin, the fender that comes from any angle. Wow, how do you take that? And that includes back and back with courage, floating across the front, plucking it from four back. It's freaky stuff, really, his marking. And it's sticky fingers. He just didn't fumble the ball. And if the modern day players, that's Sesay at Hawthorn's like that. This kid's a bit like Sesay. Sesay plays both ends as well. So the kid, we don't know the limits on all that because our sample size is a bit small in that he's played 10 or 11 games at Gippsland, 3 for Vic Country. But those glimpses are fantastic images of a rising talent. He's still growing. He's 3, 6'4", grown 2 centimetres this year as well, and looks like he could still grow again. And that's why he ended up being talked about as a top tenner as we got to the end of the year. There's some talk of him going at 2, with North loved him, but that might have been a bit rich with so many other midfielders that were rock solid. But no surprise to see him then go at 10 on what he did in the second half of the year. And then his testing was brilliant. He cleaned up the running vertical jump. No surprise there with both his size and his absolute jump or centimetres there. So he's going to take a few Mark of the Year nominations, I think, in his career. And we hope that you see those glimpses pretty early and the Saints fans really love his career.
With all the talk of St Kilda looking at one of those kind of 6 or 7, elite, genuine midfielders, were you at all surprised by the selections of Travaglia and Taru there, or were they legitimately the next 2 best available players?
Well, I think, I was talking about the number 1 being 7 chances, all midfielders, and you could have a debate for all of those, the 2 taller ones, the quicker ones, the rock solid over 3-year ones, they're all slightly different with their main weapons. And then once you get through that, and that's the way it turned out, I couldn't have picked the order in a fit. The clubs picked their order, but then it become would it be the tall forwards? Will it be Armstrong or a Shanahan or a Whitlock, or will it be the other great performers like a Travaglia or Taru, the rising star of them all? He was in the conversation around that. And obviously the Saints prioritised probably defence. There has to be an emphasis both on next best player in their minds, but also to be thinking a little bit about what the priorities in positions and the type of player they wanted, I'd imagine. We're not privy to what the clubs talk about there, and that's okay. We're just on the outside looking in, and not surprised to see those boys right up there in the first, the first 10 taken, and very optimistic about the first number of years of their careers.
You touched on Barrett briefly, Bendigo teammate of Travaglia, and most of these write-ups that we read about have a common theme where it's desperate, courageous, hard-working. Seemed to be a bit of a feature of that as well. And Barrett had been linked as a swing option that can play forward but can obviously be adept down back. Your assessment of him and where he landed?
What number was it in the finish? It might have been at
about 30.
32.
Yeah.
32. Well, it's amazing how things bob up. I'd seen him as a forward just about the whole time last year, and then in the first part of this year as a forward. Tim Membry type of forward. He's a great mark, fantastic mark. He's about 193 or 4, so 6'4", good sized boy. Then Vic Country had a problem with finding a tall defender, and so he bobs up playing defence for Vic Country in those games, matched up on often the best tall forward, and could play above that height too. He could play on someone, 4 or 5 centimetres bigger, or even the medium forward that might be about 193, 6'4". They're medium these days. And he did very well in those games. And again, his real weapon is his both talented marking, his leap, and his courage in the air. So he's a clunker and can play both ends. And then one of the best and fairest, we mentioned that. Tested really well. He's got a yard of pace, 3.02 for 20. So he's got that burst, which allows him to close down the tall forwards that get on the burst. He's got some speed there. And that toughness in the air, both to mark or to spoil, is a signature part of his game. So, yeah, I always thought he was somewhere in the 30s or maybe early 40s around that mark. And again, an emphasis probably on defence or the swingman advantage that he does have. Might have been the reason they chose him at 32, but was always going to get drafted. It was a case of where he had a taste, that game there at Essendon too in the VFL this year as part of his development. So he'll be a great mate of the other boy from Bendigo in Tobie. A boy from, he's also been to St Joseph's for Chukers. If you Charlie Reid, he would have been a mate of his from school up there. So it's another country boy getting his chance with the Saints.
We've mentioned the club looking at those big-bodied midfielders early with those top couple of selections, but I imagine having seen some highlights and seen a little bit throughout the year, they would have been rapt to get Hugh Boxel out of WA, mid-40s pick. What can you tell us about the tall mid from WA?
Boxel, yeah, he's a boy that, again, missed the start of the Nationals, but he's a contested ball winner. I thought he was like a Jai Caldwell type from Essendon. Very clean hands, wins it at stoppage, sets it up with creativity, and then he didn't make it to national level in amongst the 67 that we had in Melbourne for combine testing, but he was easily the most impressive kid when we went to WA a week later and looked at their 10 or 12 other boys. He was a star at that. Speed, endurance, he killed them in that 2K, ended up ranked in the top half a dozen for that. So his professionalism stood out. That kid's well prepared. So he was in around the mix at that point with the way he both prepared himself and then played. A premiership player there at Claremont, of course, at under 18 level at the end of the year, second best on the ground. So, yeah, had a fantastic year.
Now, what could maybe be described as steal of the draft? A lot of people have already said that that's what he will be. Alix Dodson, he was predicted to go between about 15 to 30, maybe just a little bit later than that. We take him with pick 53. I think we were quite surprised that he was still there at that point and just probably couldn't believe that he fell into our lap at that point. So does he have that potential to be as big as where they say he was expecting to go, and sort of how far off do you reckon he might be? He's got to work under Marshall. How many years do you reckon we might see until he almost could step up as the number one?
Well, I'll tell you what was crossing my mind. I thought I've missed something here when he's still on the boards. We're in the 40s and, well, even in the 30s, still there, 40s, still there. And I'm thinking I've missed something. He's probably going to go to college basketball, and I just didn't find out. That's what I was thinking. If I missed something completely, I've been blindsided by it because, he had that choice that he was weighing up a couple of months back as to whether he took that college offer. There's even offers to go into the NBL here that he's considering, because early in the year he played for Australia over in Germany in a basketball tournament. He missed the first game of the Nationals because of that basketball tournament, so he was multi-talented. And so I'm checking in my head, who do I speak to last? I'm thinking, have I got the accurate? Because he's still there, and I couldn't believe it. And I knew that clubs would want a ruckman. There was a number of clubs that desperately had to get one. But they played the patient game, St Kilda, and ended up nabbing him. It was amazing that the All-Australian ruckman still there in the 50s, and he won that honour easily, the way he played in those 3 games of national championships for South Australia. Yeah, very mobile. He's around the 202, 203, 6'8". He's got a lighter body, but he'll get round the ground and get the ball. He's like a ruck rover at that level. He will need to thicken out a little bit, so just be patient. Might take a year or so. He might get a few little glimpses for the first year or two, but once his body's there, he looks capable. He's like a Brodie Grundy. He'd get around the ground and get a lot of the ball. Or Rowan Marshall, those sorts of boys. That then supports the smaller players by not just getting the ball and setting it up for them with his hands, but creating some space for him. He competes really hard at ground level as well as high up in the air. So, yeah, might end up in time one of the great choices in the 50s.
Yeah, it feels like modern drafting has gone down that path more and more, that teams are reluctant to take ruckman early. And it's almost like they want an immediate return on the investment.
Yeah.
And they feel at ruckman that they're more inclined to go and get say, Tom Campbell, like Melbourne got when we passed him over, to get someone who could play straight away. So hopefully that does work out. I know they're looking at the South Australian ruckman as well, potentially, for giving him a spot. But Patrick, is it, or Said? I've heard his name pronounced a couple of ways. Is there a little ethnic sort of twinge to that? Or
I think it's Said.
Said, yeah. As a player, he looked pretty sharp from the highlights that I saw, where pretty accurate kick for goal. He was a guy that I didn't know a lot about until I had a look at that, but he looks a reasonable type.
Yeah, he fulfills all of the things you'd probably go over before you touch a player. What are his fundamentals like? Well, his fundamentals are very good. Doesn't fumble a ball, is a magnificent kick. At one point this year, I think he did for the year 24 goals, 6 he kicked. I remember knowing it wasn't as high as that. Might have been 18 goals he kicked at the time I was watching him play late in the year. It was on 50. Well, he's put it through middle, way over the pack. Oh, wow. He is a brilliant kick. So he's known for his finishing. That's no doubt a weapon of his. His testing was very good at combine. He's quick enough. He had good endurance as well. So all those things, you're ticking boxes along the way, and he's runner-up in their best and fairest at Calder. And you're stuck at Vic Metro behind all the blokes we talked about, all those midfielders, all those, 5 or 6 of the stars of the draft are all keeping him out of getting on the stage where he might have shown that he can mix it with those kids. So they've done the homework there, and I think they've picked up a pretty good choice. And I'm just checking on the number he went there at 60. Gee, that's a pretty good choice at 60 of the. There might have been 71 taken on the night, so he's a late choice, but he'll come up pretty well when you look closely at his vision as you have, and even at his CV over the course of the year. But watch for that weapon with his kicking.
There were a couple of academy kids tied to St Kilda, and then, of course, Elwood Peckett, father-son, Frankie Peckett's boy. Were you surprised that none of them were taken by St Kilda? Obviously, Lennox Hoffman was selected by Geelong with one of those late picks. Were you surprised that Adrian Cole wasn't selected? Because that was kind of what the hints were leading into the draft, that one of those picks would be Adrian Cole from the academy. Or was it just that, they were able to get a bunch of defenders earlier in the draft and potentially that type of player didn't fit anymore?
It's probably the latter. It's probably what you're saying there. To finish, once they come away with the hand of Taru and Barrett in particular, it might have been less likely they'd take another tall defender. Maybe it was open on the night. I'm not sure. I'm not sure of the inner workings of their debate on it. But Cole's the type of boy that would step up and play some VFL and can still come through as a mature age player. I love the way he competes again in the air. He's played on some of the best forwards that we had at national championship level and beaten them or matched them in big games. He's about the same size as Barrett, about 194, 195. And with that, his dad, Nigerian background, so he's eligible under that NGA. And I just really hope that he can step up and play some very good VFL footy next year and prove them wrong, because, the clubs all don't get it right every time, and sometimes it might have been the victim of circumstance. Yes, we've got plenty of defenders now. We can't take either Hoffman or Cole. We've ended up in the top 30, getting 3 of them, and it's not our priority later. So that's the way it's possibly turned out. But great to see Hoffman get a go. I loved his intercept marking in the finals, and even for Vic Metro, his ability to do that. He tested pretty well too. He's quite quick. That's the way it goes. We all see it reasonably differently. The clubs do. And as we say, sometimes they overlook players that end up having great careers. Look at Jaron Geary, back to him as a rookie. So I think that Adrian Cole will be a very good VFL player over the next couple of years, and hopefully he gets a chance in that period to get onto a list, because I think he's got some real quality.
Even thinking about outside of players that we weren't particularly looking at, is there any names that surprised you that didn't get picked up on the night, that you were sort of thinking, you were almost sold that they would be going somewhere? Or is a name that we should follow and think that maybe, or touch wood, we don't have any long-term injuries during the season, but if we do need something to come in, is there any names that we probably should follow during the year and just keep tabs on?
I think young Bailey McKenzie, the boy from Sandringham. Hopefully he plays at the Zebras, and that's your aligned club anyway, and you get a close chance to have a look at him. He played a couple of Ripper games this year, including a final where he kicked 6. He'd kicked 7 early in the year against was the Giants Academy, I reckon, playing for Sandy. And then, as I say, double it up, the boy from Brighton Grammar. I thought he did enough to be a late draft choice or at least a rookie on those 2 games alone. He has grown in recent years. He's a boy of 192 or 3 now that really had been playing as a midfielder 3 years ago because he's only in 185 or something like that. So I think there's still scope for further development for that young fellow. And, yeah, so surprised he didn't get picked up. But, yep, that's the nature of it. Seeing things differently. The other boy you did pick up and was announced as Eamon Armstrong, the Irish boy, which we should mention as well. He's a boy that's been training with our group over in Ireland. He's a boy from Meath, the county of Meath. I tell you what, he is an outstanding athlete. I watched some vision of one of the sessions. We had a Kaya. He won that very impressively. So he can run. He will play sort of back flank wing as an elite runner. He is still at school, still finishing his schooling, so we didn't bring him out. A couple of boys come out for our combine, but we decided to leave him home on the basis he's still doing his secondary schooling. I just turned 18 in about July, I reckon. So he was certainly in the elite 2 or 3, and the Saints have signed him, and be interesting to see his progression, whether he does come out next year or finish his schooling. But he's got some elite attributes and very highly regarded by Marty Clark, who's our on-the-ground coach over there, the former Collingwood player, and Gerard Schollier scouted him along with many of the other boys in Ireland that have come out in recent years. So we're quite optimistic that boy will end up a good player down the track.
Shifter, last one for me is just a quick 2-part of it. Harry Boyd has been invited to train down at Moorabbin post-draft. What do you know about him? And then I guess just outside of that, the new kind of player movement arenas, the SPP and the mid-season draft. What do you make of those 2 innovations, and where do you think player movement's going to next? Yeah, well, I think your Harry Boyd, if is he going to train over summer? I haven't quite read that yet. I know they had a good look at him. He's the Magarey medalist, the running Magarey medalist. He'd be your guy that might come in and play for the next 2 or 3 years and be your second ruckman or even a key defender. I think he's not quite 200 centimetres. He's had an outstanding a couple of years, best and fairest winner on a couple of occasions at senior level. He's a boy originally from up around Shepparton, I reckon, played for the Murray Bush Rangers and then has become a star over in Adelaide. And as I say, played well in the state game and then won the Magarey medal. So it might be, let's call it a shorter-term fix to get someone with a mature body able to play for you straight away if they get him in for the summer and have a good look at him. So he'd be an S supplemental period chance if you go with him. So, yeah, I think that's good flexibility for clubs to be able to look at that. Brad Crouch, I noticed, has retired with his injury, not being able to overcome that. So the gap's there. If they want to pop someone in and you've got a couple of months to assess it and do it, you might have 2 or 3 in there for a look and make a choice on who can help you the best. And then the mid-season draft, there's normally about 15 get picked up. You know, some of those taller developing kids that weren't quite ready. No one was going to call their name out this time. Halfway through next year, things turn pretty quickly and they get opportunities. I think that's worked for the game and allowing those boys that are overlooked to have a short-term goal to try and present mid-year and have a great summer and a great start to their 2025 season. So it adds a bit more flexibility.
A quick one I was just going to say, we'll put you on the spot here and we can revisit this when it happens next year. But first one of our draftees that debut next year. Who are you putting who are you backing there?
Travaglia, I'd think, would be a safest bet just on what I've seen of him in the last 2 years. Yeah, just didn't put a foot wrong. He played so well in that big game that when the Metro played the Country, we're at Marvel Stadium, the roof shut, fast track, winner takes the championship. Well, he was in the best 3 on the ground in that game. No doubt in the world. Killed him in that, and that's the proving ground. I haven't added them up, but I reckon there were 40 drafted, maybe out of that game, 35 to 40. Now, all the best kids are in it, and he's come up in the best. I think I gave him 2 votes in that game, so he was in the best 2 or 3 in the out there on the ground that day, and he'd done that all year in the big games. So I think, although he's got a lighter body, he doesn't play like it. He's fearless, hard at it, strong. good kick of the ball, good speed. So I think he's ready to run and very passionate young man that really enjoyed draft night and enjoyed very much becoming a Saint.
Absolutely. And fingers crossed, the strike rate on the first picks has been pretty good. Phillippo and Wilson playing every game in their debut seasons as the first pick. But thanks very much, Shifter. Always a pleasure. Hopefully we get to work together at a few games over the course of the journey. But always great to get your insights and introduce some of these kids to the Saints faithful.
Who you got first up? I think I'll be watching the Saints first up.
Crows away. Adelaide
away. Oh, gee. Okay. We'll be up for it, I'm sure. But good
Might as
luck,
well
and
stay there for the
thanks
first
for having
6
us on.
weeks.
Really enjoyed the chat. And, you got some very exciting players in your group that have taken this year. Good luck to all the Saints.